The scent of brewing coffee and the low hum of the morning news were the usual harbingers of dawn in Jacob Thorne's meticulously kept apartment. But on this particular Tuesday, there was an added, almost electric, undercurrent of anticipation. His daughter, Leah, a whirlwind of vibrant youth and burgeoning intellect, was due to present her final project at the magnet school for STEM. Jacob, a man whose life was built on precision and principle, felt a familiar warmth spread through him at the thought of her. He moved with an easy grace through the sun-drenched kitchen, a testament to his disciplined routine. At 42, Jacob carried himself with quiet dignity, his broad shoulders and thoughtful eyes speaking volumes of a life lived with purpose. He was an aerospace engineer by profession, a man who found beauty and logic in the intricate designs that kept humanity soaring through the skies. His work at Astrodynamics wasn't just a job, it was a passion, a complex puzzle he relished solving, especially with the upcoming bid for the new lunar orbital platform. Yet, beyond the blueprints and equations, Jacob had always understood the importance of grounding himself in the human element of life. He was a pillar of his community, a fact often reiterated by the elders at the Southwood Community Center, where he volunteered his evenings mentoring young Black students in robotics and coding. For years, he'd spearheaded initiatives to bridge the technological divide, tirelessly advocating for better resources in underprivileged schools. This activism, born of a deep-seated belief in equity and opportunity, had earned him both admiration and, in subtle ways he was only beginning to discern, quiet resentment from certain corners of the city's established power structure. He wasn't loud or confrontational, but his unwavering commitment to justice and his uncanny ability to unite people made him a formidable, if unassuming, force. "Morning, Dad." Leah burst into the kitchen, her locks tied back in a vibrant scarf, her eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. She grabbed a piece of toast, already buttered and waiting. "Big day? Wish me luck." Jacob turned, a soft smile creasing his face. "You don't need luck, Bug. You've got talent, intelligence, and more grit than anyone I know." He poured her a glass of orange juice. "Just remember everything we've talked about. Own your space, speak with conviction, and don't let anyone dim your light." Leah grinned, a flash of her mother's radiant smile. "Got it, Commander Thorne." She took a bite of toast, humming thoughtfully. "You know, Mr. Henderson from the Zoning Commission was asking about you again yesterday at school. Said something about the West Side Development Project." Jacob's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Did he now? Mr. Henderson was a minor cog in the local political machine, but a cog nonetheless. For months, Jacob had been vocal about the proposed West Side development, a luxury apartment complex that threatened to displace several low-income families and offered little benefit to the existing community. He had organized community meetings, meticulously researched the zoning laws, and presented compelling counterproposals that advocated for affordable housing and local business integration. His calm, data-driven approach often frustrated those who preferred to steamroll over public concerns. "He seemed irritated," Leah added, sensing a shift in her father's demeanor. "Like he thought you were making his life difficult." Jacob chuckled, but there was a steely glint in his eyes. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means making things difficult for those who prefer the easy, wrong path. "Don't you ever forget that, Leah." He ruffled her hair playfully. "Now, finish up. We don't want to be late for your moment of glory." Later that morning, as Leah presented her sophisticated robotic arm prototype with effortless confidence, Jacob felt a surge of paternal pride. He watched her command the attention of the school board and a handful of local dignitaries. Among them, he noticed, was a stern-faced, impeccably dressed man he recognized as Councilman Thorne, a distant, more powerful relative of Mr. Henderson, known for his unyielding support of large corporate developments. The councilman's gaze seemed to linger on Jacob, a cold, appraising look that sent a shiver down his spine. It was fleeting, easily dismissed as a trick of the light, but the feeling of being observed persisted. That evening, after celebrating Leah's stellar presentation with pizza and her favorite sci-fi movie, Jacob retired to his small home office. The glow of his laptop illuminated an open email from the Community Action Network, an organization he had recently helped establish to provide legal aid and support for residents facing unjust eviction or discrimination. He was drafting a press release concerning the latest maneuvers by the West Side developers, detailing their questionable land acquisition tactics. He paused, a flicker of unease passing through him. He was making powerful enemies, that much was clear. His phone buzzed, a message from Marcus, a trusted friend and fellow activist, warning him about increased surveillance around their community center. Heard whispers about a cleanup operation targeting troublemakers. Marcus wrote, "Stay vigilant, brother." Jacob leaned back in his chair, taking a slow, deep breath. He was no stranger to the subtle pressures, the quiet dismissals, the veiled threats that came with challenging the status quo. He had seen it play out in the lives of others he'd tried to help. That's precisely why, over the years, he had meticulously built his own protocol, a series of contingency plans, encrypted files, and trusted contacts, a silent failsafe should he ever find himself caught in the very system he fought against. It wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. He knew, instinctively, that his integrity and his race made him a target, particularly when he dared to wield influence. He had always believed in the power of the truth, but he was also pragmatic enough to know that truth often needed a push, and sometimes a shield. He finalized the press release, attached a detailed report he had compiled, and scheduled it for release in the morning. He also made a quick, cryptic entry into a separate, highly encrypted digital ledger, a ledger only he knew existed, a living document of every injustice he had witnessed or fought, every questionable dealing he had uncovered. It was his last resort, his ultimate weapon, should all else fail. He closed his laptop, the hum of its fan the only sound in the quiet room. He felt a prickle of tension, a premonition of something looming on the horizon. But he dismissed it, as he always did. His duty was to Leah, to his community, and to the principles of justice he held so dear. He would not be intimidated. He would not back down. He walked into Leah's room, tucking her in, though she was almost too old for such rituals. He kissed her forehead. "Good night, Bug. Proud of you. Love you, Dad," she mumbled sleepily. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. This was what he fought for. This was his world. Little did he know, by sunrise, that world would be irrevocably shattered. The next morning, the sun rose, as always, casting long shadows across the city. Jacob was in his usual spot in the kitchen, making breakfast, when a harsh, insistent pounding rattled his front door. He frowned, glancing at the clock. Too early for a delivery. Too late for a casual visit. He opened the door to find two uniformed officers, their faces grim, standing on his porch. Behind them, he saw the familiar, cold gaze of Councilman Thorne, standing by a dark sedan parked discreetly down the street. The councilman offered a thin, almost imperceptible smirk. "Mr. Jacob Thorne?" one of the officers asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "Yes," Jacob replied, his senses instantly on high alert. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Before he could even process the words, before Leah could even stir from her bed, the world Jacob Thorne knew, the world he fought so hard to protect, began to crumble around him. He saw the flash of the camera in the distance, capturing his shocked face, and knew, with chilling certainty, that this was no random incident. This was a trap, a carefully laid one, and he was caught. The world outside Jacob's front door dissolved into a chaotic blur. The officers, efficient and detached, cuffed him with a practiced swiftness that spoke of countless similar arrests. He caught a glimpse of Leah, her face a mask of terror and confusion, appearing in the hallway. Her frantic, questioning gaze, a silent plea for understanding, was a searing pain in his chest. "Dad? What's happening?" she cried, her voice thin and reedy. "It's okay, Leah. It's a mistake," he managed, his voice strained, even as his eyes sought hers, trying to convey a strength he barely felt. He wanted to tell her everything, to assure her he had a plan, but the words caught in his throat, replaced by the metallic click of the squad car door. As they drove away, he saw Councilman Thorne still standing by his car, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a chilling confirmation of the conspiracy Jacob had only suspected. The journey to Blackwood Correctional Facility was a descent into a different kind of reality. Each mile seemed to strip away another layer of his identity, another piece of his carefully constructed life. The sterile, impersonal processing at the jail was a dehumanizing gauntlet of forms, fingerprints, and cold stares. He was Jacob Thorne, a respected engineer, a community leader, a father. Here, he was just another number, another black face in a system designed to crush and contain. The air in Blackwood was thick with the scent of disinfectant, stale sweat, and an underlying current of fear. The walls were a dull, oppressive gray, the sounds a constant, unsettling symphony of clanging metal, distant shouts, and the low murmur of unseen voices. This wasn't a place of rehabilitation, it was a place of containment, and Jacob felt its weight immediately. His first official encounter with the prison's hierarchy was with Warden Harrison, a portly, middle-aged white man with a deceptively calm demeanor and eyes that held a calculating, predatory glint. Harrison sat behind a large, imposing desk, a flag of the state hanging limply behind him, an ironic symbol of the justice he dispensed. Standing beside him was the senior guard, McGregor, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a perpetually sneering expression, his uniform straining over a muscular frame. McGregor's eyes, small and cold, raked over Jacob, lingering with an almost palpable disdain. "Jacob Thorne," Harrison began, his voice a low, gravelly drawl, a saccharine sweetness coating the words that did nothing to mask the underlying venom. "A man of the community, I hear. An activist. Interesting." He paused, a theatrical sigh escaping him. "Seems your activism landed you in a bit of a pickle, didn't it?" Jacob met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I am innocent, Warden. This is a setup." Harrison's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Innocent, are we? Well, in Blackwood, Mr. Thorne, innocent is a luxury few can afford. And activism usually just means making trouble for the wrong people." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, laced with passive aggression. "I understand you're a single father. Must be hard on the little girl. A shame, really, for a child to see her father in a place like this." McGregor grunted, a sound of dismissive agreement. "Kids usually learn quickly who's good for 'em and who ain't, Warden." The implied threat, subtly delivered, hung heavy in the air. They were targeting Leah. This wasn't just about his freedom, it was about his family. Jacob felt a cold fury, but he kept his face impassive. He knew this game. He'd seen it before, heard the stories in the community meetings. It was a calculated psychological tactic, designed to break him down, to make him compliant. "You'll be housed in Unit C, Mr. Thorne," Harrison continued, his tone shifting, now more overtly condescending. "It's cozy. Plenty of time for reflection. Perhaps you can write a new community action plan from there." The thinly veiled sarcasm was a deliberate jab, mocking his past efforts. As McGregor escorted him away, their path wound through dimly lit corridors, past barred cells from which hollow eyes watched. McGregor's movements were deliberately slow, his presence a heavy, oppressive weight. He stopped at a cell, its metal door scratched and graffitied, and gestured inside with a jerk of his head. "Home sweet home, activist," McGregor sneered, his voice a low growl, leaning in close. "You think you're smart, don't you? With your fancy words and your big ideas. Well, in here, your ideas don't mean jack. You're just another inmate. And I've seen plenty like you come through these doors. They all break eventually. Every single one." Jacob stepped into the small, cramped cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind him, the sound echoing like a death knell. The cot was hard, the toilet rusted, and a small, grimy window offered a sliver of the gray sky. But even in this desolate space, Jacob felt a perverse sense of clarity. The trap was sprung. The game had begun. He was the protagonist, yes, but he was also the target of a deeply entrenched, racially biased system. He recognized the microaggressions, the dismissive tone, the undermining of his character and achievements. They wanted him to feel powerless, to internalize the narrative of his guilt and insignificance. They wanted him to forget who he was, to forget Leah. But they had underestimated him. Jacob had walked into this prison as an innocent man, but he was not a naive one. His years of fighting for justice had taught him patience, observation, and the crucial importance of a backup plan. He had foreseen such a possibility, had prepared for the eventuality that his integrity would make him a target. He ran a hand over the rough concrete wall, his mind already racing. He didn't have his encrypted ledger here, or his contacts list, but he had his mind, his keen analytical skills, and a burning desire to return to Leah. His hidden mechanism wasn't just a file, It was a way of thinking, a method of systematic dismantling. He began to mentally map out the prison layout, observing the guard rotations, the subtle power dynamics among the inmates, the routines, and the deviations. He would find the cracks, the vulnerabilities. He would expose Harrison and McGregor. He would ensure that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. The first step was to survive. The second was to observe. The third, he knew, would be to strike. The warden and his men might think they had him contained, broken, but they had merely given a meticulous engineer a new, complex problem to solve. And Jacob Thorne was very good at solving problems. The first few days in Blackwood were a brutal indoctrination. Jacob was assigned to the laundry detail, a sweltering, cacophonous space filled with the roar of industrial machines and the stench of harsh detergents. It was a deliberate choice, he knew. Menial, exhausting labor designed to break spirits. But for Jacob, it was an opportunity. He moved through the steam-filled room, his body aching, his mind a steel trap, observing. He watched the guards, their shifts, their blind spots, their preferred routines. McGregor, in particular, seemed to take perverse pleasure in micromanaging the laundry, his presence a constant, sneering shadow. He made racially charged comments, disguised as casual banter, to the black inmates, always just within the bounds of plausible deniability, always with that chilling undertone of power. Working hard, boys. Don't want those white sheets looking anything less than pristine. Now do we? He'd bellow, a forced laugh following. Jacob absorbed it all, storing each incident, each patronizing glance, each thinly veiled insult. He also watched the inmates. There was a hierarchy, unspoken but rigid. He noticed the quiet desperation, the hardened resignation, and the flickering sparks of defiance in some eyes. He saw who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who had privileges and who was constantly punished. His engineer's brain, accustomed to dissecting complex systems, began to construct a mental blueprint of Blackwood, its hidden mechanisms, and its glaring flaws. His cellmate, a quiet, older man named Silas, was his first cautious connection. Silas, imprisoned for a minor offense that spiraled due to an overburdened and biased public defender system, had been in Blackwood for years. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the prison's inner workings and its history of corruption, though he rarely spoke of it. "Keep your head down, Thorne," Silas rasped one night, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. "They don't like smart men here. Especially not your kind." "My kind?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The kind that asks questions. The kind that thinks they can change things. Harrison breaks them all. Or McGregor does his dirty work." He paused. "Heard you were an activist on the outside. Tried to stir up trouble," they said. Jacob didn't deny it. "I tried to stir up justice." Silas was silent for a long moment. "Justice is a foreign language in here, son." But something in his tone suggested he harbored a deep-seated resentment for that very fact. He began to offer Jacob small, seemingly insignificant pieces of information. The guard who took extra breaks in the south corridor, the loose floor tile in the old utility closet, the way certain favored inmates received special treatment in exchange for information on others. These were tiny threads, but Jacob saw the potential to weave them into a larger tapestry. His hidden mechanism wasn't just about external contacts. It was about internal preparation. He began to secretly document everything. He learned to write tiny, almost invisible notes on the margins of old library books he was allowed to borrow, using a sharpened pencil stub he'd found. He developed a system of codes, remembering names, dates, and specific incidents. He memorized conversations, facial expressions, and even the subtle shifts in Harrison's tone when he was particularly pleased with McGregor's discipline. The psychological pressure from Harrison and McGregor was unrelenting. During meal times, Jacob would often find his tray with less food, or his water cup mysteriously spilled. During yard time, McGregor would make a point of walking past him, lingering just long enough to deliver a patronizing remark about his daughter, subtly implying he knew where she lived, or that her future was now precarious. "Heard little Leah's still out there. Must be tough, growing up without a father around. Thorne? Especially one who's a criminal." Each barb was a calculated attempt to erode Jacob's composure, to push him to react, to give them an excuse for more severe punishment. But Jacob held firm. He knew that any outburst would only validate their narrative of the angry black man, further cementing his guilt in their eyes and in the records. He responded with silence, with a calm, unblinking gaze that subtly unnerved McGregor, making the guard's frustration palpable. One afternoon, while working in the laundry, Jacob noticed a pattern. A specific CCTV camera, positioned near the back exit used for supply deliveries, consistently developed a glitch for precisely 15 minutes every Tuesday afternoon, right when a particular guard, Officer Davies, a younger, visibly uncomfortable white officer who seemed less entrenched in the prison's racist culture, was on duty. It was a small window, but a consistent one. It suggested either negligence or, more intriguingly, a silent act of subtle defiance. Jacob tested this theory. During one of these glitches, he purposefully dropped a stack of clean uniforms near the blind spot, lingering a moment longer than necessary, observing. Davies, instead of immediately admonishing him, merely cleared his throat and looked away, his face etched with a discomfort that spoke volumes. It was a tiny spark of humanity, a potential opening. He began to cultivate this connection subtly, offering Davies a respectful nod, a quiet, "Good morning, officer," when others might have been resentful or silent. He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply existed, dignified and observant, in a place designed to strip men of both. He was building a web, thread by thread, from the inside out. He was creating his own intelligence network, one observation, one whispered word, one subtle glance at a time. The seeds of resistance were being sown, carefully, patiently, in the harsh, unforgiving soil of Blackwood. Weeks bled into months. Jacob's routine in Blackwood became a finely honed instrument of survival and data collection. Every guard shift, every inmate interaction, every subtle change in the prison's rhythm was processed and filed away in his mind. The notes, painstakingly inscribed on stolen paper scraps and hidden within the hollowed-out spine of an old law textbook, grew in volume. They detailed McGregor's racially charged inspections, Harrison's manipulative threats about Leah's welfare, and numerous instances of unequal treatment and blatant abuse towards other black inmates. He even managed to sketch crude maps of the surveillance camera blind spots, triangulating the exact moments of their glitches. His quiet exchanges with Silas deepened into a cautious trust. Silas, fueled by years of suppressed rage against the system, became an unwitting accomplice, often directing Jacob's attention to specific, hidden aspects of the prison's operations, or confirming Jacob's suspicions about certain corrupt guards. "That's C.O. Miller," Silas muttered one evening. "He's the one that lets the special deliveries come in through the north gate on Tuesdays. Always during the shift change, almost like clockwork." Jacob noted it down, another piece of the puzzle. The crucial link, however, remained Officer Davies. Jacob's subtle gestures of respect had slowly chipped away at the young guard's cynicism. Davies, though fearful of Harrison and McGregor, harbored a quiet unease about the blatant injustices he witnessed. He was a decent man caught in a corrupt machine, and Jacob recognized that flicker of conscience. The moment came on a particularly tense Tuesday afternoon. The laundry room was stifling, the air thick with steam and tension. McGregor had just finished another round of humiliating remarks, his eyes lingering on Jacob with an almost palpable desire for him to break. But Jacob merely continued folding, his expression unreadable. During the designated glitch, time for the camera near the supply exit, Jacob seized his opportunity. He feigned a stumble, dropping a large sack of uniforms near Officer Davies. As he bent to retrieve them, he subtly nudged a small, folded piece of paper towards Davies' foot, a nearly imperceptible movement hidden by the folds of the heavy linen. Davies, startled, glanced down, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as he registered the tiny, tightly folded paper. For a split second, fear warred with something else in his gaze, perhaps a glimmer of understanding, or even a nascent sense of moral responsibility. McGregor was distracted, shouting at another inmate across the room. It was now or never. Davies subtly shifted his foot, covering the paper. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what this meant. He knew the risks. But looking at Jacob, who met his gaze with an unwavering, dignified stare, a silent plea for justice that transcended words, something in Davies snapped. He stooped, ostensibly to adjust his boot, and scooped up the paper, his movements quick and practiced. Jacob held his breath, watching Davies. The young officer straightened, his face carefully blank, but a faint flush crept up his neck. He quickly slipped the paper into his uniform pocket, his hand lingering for a moment, a silent acknowledgement. The exchange was done. The first thread had been cast. The paper contained no frantic plea. Instead, it was a meticulously compiled, coded message. It included the precise date and nature of Jacob's false arrest, corroborated by the names of the officers involved and the specific, questionable details of the alleged crime. More importantly, it contained a cryptic reference to Project West Side and the name, Councilman Thorne, along with an encrypted string of characters that, if decoded, would lead to the secure digital ledger Jacob had prepared before his arrest, his protocol. The message was addressed to Elena Rodriguez, a tenacious investigative journalist Jacob had worked with on previous community projects, a woman he trusted implicitly and who had a reputation for fearlessly pursuing truth, even against powerful interests. He had included a small, unique symbol that only she would recognize as coming from him. Hours later, the anxiety gnawed at Jacob. Had Davies been seen? Would he betray him? Would Elena even get the message? He knew the risks were immense. If Harrison or McGregor discovered his actions, the consequences would be dire, not just for him, but potentially for Leah. Meanwhile, miles away, in the bustling newsroom of the City Tribune, Elena Rodriguez was sifting through a stack of anonymous tips and press releases. Her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was a quick, clipped call from a burner phone, the voice on the other end distorted but clear enough. "Check the Dropbox, Rodriguez. Look for the Thorne file. It's time." The call ended. Elena, intrigued, checked the secured digital Dropbox she maintained for sensitive information. There it was, a file, encrypted, marked with the unique symbol Jacob had told her to look for years ago, a safety measure for a time just like this. Her heart leaped. Jacob Thorne, arrested months ago on what she had always suspected was a trumped-up charge. She knew his integrity. She knew his fight against the West Side development. A cold knot formed in her stomach. This was big. This was dangerous. Back in Blackwood, Jacob lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He felt a fragile sense of hope, mixed with a chilling awareness of the heightened danger. He had dropped the stone. Now, he waited for the ripples to reach the shore. Harrison and McGregor might still rule their small kingdom with an iron fist, but a silent alarm had been triggered. The higher system, the one that operated beyond their immediate reach, had received its first, unsettling signal. The unraveling had begun. The encrypted string of characters Jacob had included in his message proved to be a masterstroke. Elena Rodriguez, working late into the night, fed it into a specialized decryption program Jacob had shared with her years ago for high-stakes community data. What emerged was a link to a hidden cloud server, accessible only through a multi-factor authentication protocol. Inside, a treasure trove of meticulously organized files awaited: scanned documents, audio recordings, time-stamped photos, and detailed personal accounts. Jacob's living ledger of systemic corruption. Elena spent the next 72 hours in a blur of caffeine and code, her journalist's intuition screaming that she had stumbled onto something monumental. The ledger didn't just detail the West Side development's shady dealings. It painted a damning picture of a larger network of influence peddling, discriminatory practices, and, chillingly, a pattern of targeting community leaders who dared to speak out. Jacob Thorne wasn't just a victim. He was a chronicler of injustice. His own arrest, she realized, was no isolated incident, but a retaliatory strike, a calculated attempt to silence him. The first critical piece of information from the ledger was the detailed account of Jacob's own setup. It named the two arresting officers, provided the exact address of the supposed crime scene, a derelict warehouse with no known connection to Jacob, and even hinted at a key witness whose testimony was suspiciously flimsy. Armed with this, Elena began her quiet probe. She contacted a trusted, veteran legal aid lawyer, Arthur Finch, known for his relentless pursuit of justice for the marginalized. Finch, initially skeptical of Jacob's case, had found himself blocked at every turn by vague denials and bureaucratic stonewalling. Elena's evidence provided the missing key. "This is explosive, Elena," Finch said, his voice grave. after reviewing the initial batch of files. If even a quarter of this is true, we're looking at a deeply corrupted system, not just a few bad apples. It's all true, Arthur. Jacob doesn't deal in speculation, Elena countered, her eyes hard. He's always been meticulous. He prepared for this. He just needs us to be his voice. Finch nodded slowly, starting with his own case. We'll need a federal angle. Local law enforcement is clearly compromised. I'll make some calls, discreetly. We can't afford to tip them off yet. Meanwhile, within the gray walls of Blackwood, subtle shifts began to occur. Warden Harrison, a man acutely attuned to the whispers of power, started to feel an unfamiliar prickle of unease. A routine state audit, usually a perfunctory exercise, suddenly intensified. Questions that were typically glossed over were now being asked with pointed precision by a new, unusually diligent junior auditor. She lingered longer, checked more records, and showed an unnerving interest in the discrepancies in the budget for inmate welfare programs. Harrison, of course, dismissed it internally, just a zealous new hire. But the persistent probing was irksome. He called McGregor to his office. Anything unusual, McGregor? Harrison asked, drumming his fingers on his desk. Any complaints reaching the outside? McGregor, ever the blunt instrument, scoffed. No, sir. We keep a tight lid here. Thorne's still playing the martyr, but he hasn't done anything. Just keeps to himself, mostly. Keep an eye on him. And the others, Harrison commanded, his voice hardening. I don't like this feeling. Something's in the air. His gaze drifted to the framed photo of him shaking hands with Councilman Thorne, a symbol of their mutually beneficial alliance. He called the councilman, but his usual easy access was met with an uncharacteristic delay. When he finally got through, Councilman Thorne's tone was curt, evasive. Just a few minor inquiries, Harrison. Nothing to worry about. Just be extra diligent, understood? The implied warning was unmistakable. Inside Blackwood, Jacob continued his painstaking work, oblivious to the ripples his message had created. The pressure from McGregor and Harrison remained relentless. During a random cell search, McGregor deliberately overturned Jacob's few personal effects, his eyes scanning for any hint of a hidden message or tool. He found nothing, but the act was a clear message. We're watching you. One evening, after the lights were out, Silas whispered, They're tightening things up, Thorne. More patrols, more searches. Even the food's gotten worse. Someone ruffled some feathers higher up. Jacob listened, his heart a steady drum. He knew. This was the beginning. The higher system was stirring. The unseen forces were starting to move. He had set a chain of events in motion, and now he had to weather the storm it would inevitably bring. He remained outwardly calm, but internally, his focus sharpened. He had provided the initial spark. Now, he needed to be ready to provide more fuel when the fire truly began to burn. The game had just moved to a more dangerous, higher stakes level. Elena Rodriguez and Arthur Finch became an unstoppable force. Jacob's digital ledger was the Rosetta Stone, providing not just undeniable evidence, but also crucial leads. Finch, leveraging his extensive network in Washington, secured the interest of a meticulous federal prosecutor's office, known for its tenacity in civil rights cases. The investigation began to expand, discreetly at first, then with a gathering momentum that felt like an approaching storm. They started by re-examining Jacob's original arrest. Elena's deep dive into local property records, cross-referenced with Jacob's detailed notes, revealed that the derelict warehouse where the alleged crime occurred was slated for demolition as part of the very West Side development Jacob had opposed. The key witness, a transient with a long rap sheet, had suddenly disappeared after Jacob's conviction, but Elena found a paper trail leading to a significant cash payment made to an offshore account shortly after his testimony. The pieces began to interlock, forming a chilling picture of a targeted takedown. But the ledger also pointed beyond Jacob. It contained cryptic references to other inmates, previous incidents within Blackwood, and names of officers and administrators involved. Elena and Finch broadened their scope, seeking out families of other black men who had been incarcerated at Blackwood under questionable circumstances or whose complaints of mistreatment had been ignored. They found Maria Jenkins, whose son, Jamal, had died in Blackwood's infirmary 2 years prior, officially from natural causes. Jamal had been serving a minor sentence but had a history of health issues that, according to his medical records from outside, required careful monitoring. Jacob's ledger contained a detailed account of Jamal's final days, including a conversation Jacob overheard between McGregor and a prison medic, dismissing Jamal's cries for help as attention-seeking. The ledger even indicated a sudden change in Jamal's medication, without proper authorization, just days before his death. Then there was the case of Reverend Elijah Vance, a charismatic community leader from a neighboring district who, like Jacob, had been a vocal opponent of discriminatory housing policies. Vance had served 5 years in Blackwood on a drug charge that many believed was a blatant fabrication. His conviction had been largely based on the testimony of a confidential informant whose identity was never revealed, and who, Jacob's ledger implied, was a known associate of McGregor. Vance, now out of prison but a broken man, had always maintained his innocence. Elena and Finch found him, hesitant but willing to speak, once he understood the gravity of their investigation. These were just the initial threads, but they confirmed Jacob's meticulousness and the deeply ingrained nature of the corruption. Each new discovery amplified the urgency, revealing not just isolated acts of racism, but a systemic pattern of abuse and injustice perpetuated by those in power. Warden Harrison, meanwhile, grew increasingly agitated. The low-level state audit had quietly morphed into a more comprehensive federal inquiry. Federal agents, polite but unyielding, began appearing at Blackwood, requesting access to obscure personnel files, financial records for the prison's suppliers, and inmate grievance logs, often asking specifically about incidents reported in Unit C, where Jacob was housed. The queries were never direct about Jacob, but the focus was unmistakable. Harrison knew the pressure was mounting. His calls to Councilman Thorne were now met with voicemail. The councilman, sensing the shifting winds, was distancing himself. Harrison felt a cold dread creeping in. Someone was digging. Someone was talking. And he knew, with a visceral certainty, it had to be Thorne. He summoned McGregor. "Thorne is the leak, Mac. I feel it in my gut. He's smarter than he lets on. He's got friends on the outside. Find out how he's doing it. And if you can't find it, break him until he tells you." The psychological warfare against Jacob intensified dramatically. His meager visitation rights were arbitrarily revoked, then reinstated, then revoked again, creating a cruel cycle of hope and despair for Leah, who now only saw her father through the strained filter of an unsympathetic public defender. His cell was subjected to daily, brutal shakedowns, where his few possessions were systematically destroyed, his books torn, his cot slashed. McGregor, now openly hostile, made a point of personally overseeing Jacob's daily movements, his sneering remarks laced with explicit threats. "Heard your little girl's been asking about you, Thorne. Wonder how she'll manage without her big, strong daddy. The state has ways of looking after kids whose fathers are problematic." He even orchestrated a staged confrontation with a group of intimidating, hardened inmates, known to be loyal to Harrison, hoping to provoke Jacob into a fight that would land him in solitary. But Jacob, despite the gnawing fear for Leah and the exhaustion, refused to break. He met McGregor's hateful gaze with an unwavering, calm resolve that only seemed to fuel the guard's rage. He understood this was a test, designed to push him past his limits. He continued his internal accounting, observing the desperation in Harrison's eyes, the increasing sloppiness of McGregor's threats. They were reacting, which meant his plan was working. He learned to hide his notes in even more obscure places, to carry information only in his memory, to communicate with Silas through a series of subtle glances and coded coughs. He recognized the shift. He was no longer just the victim. He was the primary target in a rapidly escalating war. The whispers from the outside had finally reached Blackwood, and the local power structure, sensing its imminent unraveling, was striking back with savage ferocity. Jacob knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that, for the first time since his arrest, he was no longer fighting alone. The federal investigation, now officially spearheaded by a dedicated task force, moved with quiet, methodical precision. Elena and Arthur provided a constant stream of intelligence from Jacob's ledger, each file meticulously cross-referenced and corroborated. What initially appeared as isolated incidents of misconduct within Blackwood began to coalesce into a chillingly coherent pattern. It wasn't just individual acts of racism. It was a carefully constructed system designed to benefit from and perpetuate racial inequity and the suppression of dissenting voices. Through financial audits, the task force uncovered a complex web of shell corporations connected to prison supply contracts that funneled exorbitant amounts of taxpayer money into the pockets of local officials. Councilman Thorne's name appeared repeatedly in the periphery of these transactions, always through intermediaries, always just outside the direct line of accountability, but with a clear pattern of benefit. The West Side development, initially a local zoning issue, was revealed to be a key component of this scheme, designed to enrich a select few by displacing vulnerable communities, with Blackwood serving as a convenient mechanism to neutralize any significant opposition, like Jacob. The medical records of Jamal Jenkins, the inmate who died in Blackwood, were re-examined by independent specialists. Jacob's notes, detailing the ignored pleas and the unauthorized medication changes, provided critical context. The official natural causes ruling was quickly overturned, replaced by strong suspicions of criminal negligence, directly implicating prison staff and administrators. Reverend Vance's case was reopened, with federal agents now pressing the local prosecutor's office on the identity and credibility of the confidential informant, who, it turned out, had a history of providing fabricated testimony in exchange for leniency in his own legal troubles. A deal facilitated, once again, by individuals connected to Harrison. The task force confirmed that Blackwood Correctional wasn't just a place where racial bias occurred. It was a profit-driven enterprise that actively cultivated an environment of fear and brutality, disproportionately targeting Black inmates, to maintain control and silence dissent. Guards were incentivized to create incidents that justified prolonged solitary confinement, which in turn increased federal funding for security. The system was designed to break men, not rehabilitate them, all while generating revenue and eliminating perceived threats to local political and economic agendas. Inside Blackwood, the atmosphere grew palpably tense. Harrison, now visibly panicked, increased security, but it only made his desperation more obvious. His usual calm facade cracked under the pressure of unannounced inspections, subpoenas, and the persistent presence of federal agents interviewing staff and inmates. He began to isolate Jacob, moving him to a more remote cell, restricting his access to the yard and the laundry. "They're asking about you, Thorne," Harrison hissed during a rare, confrontational visit to Jacob's new cell. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "They're asking about your complaints. What have you been telling them, you snake? Who are you working with?" Jacob, chained to a bolted bench, met his gaze unflinchingly. "The truth, Warden. Something you wouldn't understand." Harrison's face contorted. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you can bring down my prison? This is my kingdom, Thorne. I built it, and I'll watch you rot in it before I let you destroy it." He punched the concrete wall beside Jacob's head, the sound reverberating through the small cell. "You will tell me who you're talking to. Or your little girl. She won't have anyone left." McGregor, emboldened by Harrison's panic, became a daily tormentor. He would parade past Jacob's cell, rattling his baton against the bars, whispering threats about Leah, about the accidents that could happen to troublemakers. He arranged for Jacob to be denied critical medications, causing agonizing pain and further isolating him. Yet, through it all, Jacob held firm. He could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation that was driving their cruelty. It meant he was winning. His internal network of allies, however small, proved invaluable. Silas, despite the increased risk, found ways to relay whispered snippets of information about guard movements or official conversations. Even Officer Davies, though terrified, managed to leave a small, anonymous note during a brief, supervised pass-by. "They know about the ledger. They're looking for it inside. Be careful." Jacob knew his initial act of defiance had unleashed a tempest. The local, corrupt system was fully exposed, its tentacles reaching far beyond the prison walls. But its desperate death throes were the most dangerous. He was the central figure in their hunt for the source, and he understood that his survival, and the ultimate triumph of justice, hinged on his ability to endure this final, brutal assault. The conflict was no longer abstract. It was personal, visceral, and unfolding within the very confines of his cell. The dam broke with a sudden, deafening roar. Elena Rodriguez's meticulously researched exposé, published simultaneously in the City Tribune and several national outlets, hit like a seismic shockwave. Titled Blackwood's Black Heart: How a Correctional Facility Became a Racist Racket. It detailed Jacob Thorne's false imprisonment, the systematic abuse of black inmates, the death of Jamal Jenkins, the fabricated charges against Reverend Vance, and the intricate financial web connecting Warden Harrison, Senior Guard McGregor, and Councilman Thorne. The article didn't just expose corruption. It exposed a deeply ingrained system of racial injustice designed to crush marginalized communities for profit and political gain. The public outcry was immediate and furious. Local protests erupted, demanding justice. Federal agencies, no longer able to operate discreetly, issued an unprecedented number of subpoenas. Within days, a grand jury was convened, and a high-profile, televised public hearing was announced, presided over by a panel of federal judges and civil rights advocates. The nation's eyes turned to Blackwood. Amidst the swirling chaos, a heavily guarded convoy arrived at Blackwood. Jacob, frail but unbowed, was released on an emergency writ of habeas corpus, his original conviction officially suspended due to overwhelming evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and systemic fraud. The moment he stepped out of the prison gates, blinking at the sunlight, a wave of reporters descended. But his eyes searched only for one face. Leah. She ran into his arms, a gasp escaping her lips as she clung to him, tears streaming down her face. She had grown, matured, but her embrace was still that of his little girl. "Dad," she sobbed, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her tight, a profound relief washing over him, a sense of having finally returned from the abyss. "I told you, Bug, I'd come back." The public hearing was a spectacle of raw emotion and damning evidence. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, with media cameras broadcasting the proceedings live. Warden Harrison and Senior Guard McGregor sat at the defense table, their faces pale and drawn, their usual arrogance replaced by a visible terror. Councilman Thorne, looking utterly detached, occupied a seat further back, his lawyers already anticipating his inevitable indictment. Jacob Thorne was the star witness. Dressed in a simple, well-maintained suit provided by Arthur Finch, he took the stand, his voice steady, his eyes clear and resolute. He recounted his arrest, the subtle microaggressions, the overt threats against Leah, the daily humiliations, the systematic targeting by Harrison and McGregor. He spoke of Jamal Jenkins, of Reverend Vance, of countless other unnamed victims whose stories he had carefully preserved. "They tried to break me," Jacob testified, his gaze sweeping over Harrison and McGregor, who visibly flinched. "They tried to make me believe I was less than human, that my activism was a crime, that my daughter would be better off without me. They used my race, my integrity, against me. But they underestimated the power of truth and the strength of a community that refuses to be silenced." As Jacob spoke, Arthur Finch presented the physical evidence. The detailed notes Jacob had meticulously smuggled out, now fully decoded, were displayed on large screens. Dates, times, specific racist remarks, records of abuses, and even the subtle hand-drawn maps of Blackwood's surveillance blind spots. Then came the audio recordings, secretly obtained through Elena's network from a disgruntled former Blackwood employee. Harrison's voice, cold and calculating, discussing managing inmate populations for budget increases. McGregor's crude, racial slurs. Elena Rodriguez presented the financial analysis, linking the prison's corrupt practices directly to the West Side development and the financial beneficiaries, exposing Councilman Thorne's central role in the larger scheme. Reverend Vance, frail but dignified, recounted his own false imprisonment and the decades of racial profiling he had witnessed. Maria Jenkins, her voice trembling, held up a photo of her son, Jamal, and spoke of his agonizing final days, directly contradicting Blackwood's official reports with Jacob's detailed eyewitness account. The cumulative weight of the evidence was crushing. Harrison, his face now sickly pale, stammered through a pathetic attempt at denial, but his words were drowned out by the undeniable facts. McGregor, his usually sneering face contorted in a mix of fear and impotent rage, could only glare, his threats now hollow in the face of absolute exposure. The carefully constructed facade of the local, corrupt system collapsed, piece by piece, under the relentless assault of truth and justice. Leah sat in the front row, holding Elena's hand, tears streaming down her face. Tears not of sorrow, but of fierce pride and relief. She watched her father, not as a victim, but as a warrior, wielding integrity and intelligence against overwhelming odds. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was dismantling an entire empire of injustice. The hour of truth had arrived, and its light was blinding. The verdict, when it finally came, resonated with the force of an earthquake. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and the presentation of incontrovertible evidence, the federal panel delivered its ruling with solemn authority. Warden Harrison and Senior Guard McGregor were found guilty on multiple counts, including civil rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, criminal negligence leading to death, and operating a racketeering enterprise. Their defense, a pathetic attempt to discredit Jacob Thorne and paint the victims as habitual offenders, crumbled under the weight of the facts. Councilman Thorne, though not directly on trial in this hearing, found himself swiftly indicted on charges of corruption, fraud, and abuse of public office, his intricate web of shell corporations and illicit deals fully exposed. His political career, once seemingly unassailable, dissolved into public disgrace. Other minor figures within the Blackwood administration and local government, implicated by Jacob's ledger and the subsequent investigation, faced similar charges and immediate suspensions. The sentencing was equally decisive. Warden Harrison, stripped of his authority and his badge, received a lengthy federal prison sentence, a bitter irony that was not lost on Jacob or the public. His once imposing figure seemed to shrink, his face a mask of disbelief and fear as the judge delivered his fate. Senior Guard McGregor, the architect of so much physical and psychological torment, was handed an even harsher sentence, a stark acknowledgement of his sadistic cruelty and active participation in the abuses. He snarled and shouted profanities as he was led away, a final, futile display of the brute force that had once terrorized Blackwood. The financial ruin was immediate and absolute. The corrupt contracts were voided, the illicit gains seized by the state and federal governments, much of it earmarked for restitution to the victims and their families. Councilman Thorne's assets were frozen, his political empire crumbling into dust. The very West Side development project that had fueled so much of the corruption was halted indefinitely, its future now uncertain, its dark origins forever stained. The impact stretched far beyond the courtroom. The federal task force announced a sweeping overhaul of correctional facilities across the state, promising independent oversight, stringent anti-discrimination policies, and comprehensive training for all personnel. Blackwood Correctional Facility itself was placed under federal receivership, its entire leadership dismissed, its practices subject to radical reform. The institution that had been a symbol of oppression was now forced to become a crucible of change. Jacob watched it all unfold, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound sense of justice achieved. He saw the shattered confidence in Harrison's eyes, the impotent rage in McGregor's, and knew that their reign of terror was irrevocably over. Their small world of absolute power had been utterly obliterated by the relentless pursuit of truth and the activation of a higher, more impartial system. Leah sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. She no longer looked scared, but empowered, her eyes reflecting her father's quiet strength. She had witnessed the dark depths of injustice, but she had also seen the unwavering power of resilience and the eventual triumph of right over wrong. It was a harsh lesson, but one that had forged in her a deep understanding of integrity and the importance of fighting for what is just. The crushing of the empire was complete. The localized, corrupt system, once seemingly impenetrable, had been systematically dismantled. The men who had wielded power with such callous disregard for human dignity had finally faced their reckoning. But for Jacob, this was just the beginning of a larger journey. A journey not only of personal healing, but of continued advocacy for the systemic changes that would prevent such an empire from ever rising again. The sun, once a distant, taunting glimmer through a grimy prison window, now shone directly on Jacob Thorne's face, warm and real. Days after the federal panel's ruling, a formal ceremony was held to publicly exonerate him. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by a beaming Leah, a proud Arthur Finch, and a triumphant Elena Rodriguez, Jacob addressed the assembled crowd of supporters and journalists. His voice, once confined to whispers in a cell, now resonated with quiet power, amplified by microphones. "This isn't just my victory," Jacob declared, his gaze sweeping across the faces, many of whom had fought alongside him. "This is a victory for every voice that was silenced, every life that was broken by a system that forgot its purpose. It's a testament to the fact that integrity, even in the darkest places, can shine through. And that truth, however inconvenient, will always find its way to the light." Leah, her hand firmly intertwined with his, looked up at him with unreserved adoration. The fear and confusion that had shadowed her eyes for months had finally receded, replaced by an unwavering admiration for her father's resilience. They returned to their apartment, which, thanks to the tireless efforts of friends and community members, had been lovingly restored. The scent of coffee, the hum of the morning news, the simple rhythms of their life, once stolen, were now returned, imbued with a deeper appreciation. Blackwood Correctional Facility, under federal receivership, underwent a radical transformation. Warden Harrison's hand-picked staff were systematically replaced. New, rigorously vetted leadership was brought in, committed to transparency and genuine rehabilitation. Anti-racism training became mandatory, not a perfunctory exercise but a deeply embedded part of the institution's new ethos. Review boards, independent of the prison administration, were established to handle inmate grievances, ensuring that no complaint would ever again be ignored. Programs for education, vocational training, and mental health support, long defunded under Harrison's corrupt regime, were reinstituted and expanded. The very name, Blackwood, became synonymous not with oppression, but with the possibility of redemption and genuine reform. The ripple effects extended further. Jacob's case, and the federal inquiry it sparked, became a national precedent. Across the country, similar investigations into prison abuses and discriminatory practices gained traction. Legislators debated new laws to strengthen oversight of private and public correctional facilities, and civil rights organizations found renewed vigor in challenging systemic biases within the justice system. Jacob, though free, did not retreat from the fight. His experience had transformed him from a community activist into a powerful national advocate. He established the Thorn Justice Foundation, using the restitution funds he received to provide legal aid, support for wrongfully incarcerated individuals, and to campaign for comprehensive prison reform. He tirelessly traveled, speaking at universities, community centers, and legislative hearings, sharing his story, lending his voice to those still trapped within the system. He spoke about the importance of integrity, the dangers of unchecked power, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. He emphasized that the struggle for justice was never truly over, but that every victory, no matter how hard won, paved the way for a more equitable future. His hidden mechanism had not just freed him, it had ignited a movement. One evening, as he watched Leah, now thriving and back to her vibrant self, working on a new robotics project, Jacob felt a profound sense of peace. The scars of Blackwood remained, etched deep into his memory, but they no longer defined him. They were a testament to what he had endured and what he had overcome. He had faced an empire of injustice, built on racism and corruption, and armed with nothing but his intellect, his dignity, and a fierce love for his daughter, he had brought it to its knees. The final scene was not just one of personal triumph, but of a quiet, unwavering hope, a powerful message that even against the most formidable darkness, justice, driven by an unyielding will, could ultimately prevail. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with the enduring image of Jacob Thorne, a man unbowed, unbroken, and forever committed to the fight for a truly just world.